Hello, this is Jove Aguas once again, and welcome to my lectures in Theories on Reality. And in this lecture, I will provide a preliminary discussion on medieval philosophy to give a sort of a backgrounder or a context for my discussion on the theories on reality by the medieval philosophers like St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas. So in this short discussion, I will focus on medieval philosophy or the medieval world of Christianity, on Neoplatonism, the Patristic period, and the Scholastic period. So the development of metaphysics during the medieval times, especially during the Scholastic period, cannot be separated from the medieval world of Christianity. We know that during the Middle Ages or medieval period, uh, the most dominant philosophy is the philosophy provided by the Christian thinkers. And of course, after the Greek classical period, Christianity made its appearance and established itself in the Western world as the one true religion revealed by God and announced to men by Christ. So while metaphysics or the theories on reality still deals with reality, the question of reality about uh, what is the nature of reality. But this discussion of what reality is connected, and not just connected, but it is based on the basic Christian beliefs and doctrines, which centered, of course, on the belief in a personal God that who incarnated himself and lived with and redeemed mankind from sin. Of course, the incarnation of God is Jesus Christ. So the early Christians philosophy, or the early Christian philosophy rather, which is primarily based on Platonic doctrines, complemented with the divine revelation and interpreted reality as a creation of the divine supreme being. And during the early part of the Middle Ages, through the Christian thinkers, who were actually mostly clerics, priests, bishops, who occupied, of course, important positions, teaching positions in the big universities. They provided us with a theocentric understanding of reality. Uh, Reality is focused or centered on, or at the center of this reality rather, is the divine being, the creator. So it's God who created the world, it's God who sustains the world, it's God who uh, God communicates, relates with man. That's why we call this a theocentric understanding of reality, because at the center of this understanding is the creator or God. Okay? So reality is always understood during this period in terms of the theos, and the world is understood in terms of the spiritual doctrines and principles of Christianity. The personal God created the natural world or the physical world, and He predestined its course and governed it through the natural law, which is based on the eternal law. And so it's God who provided the natural law that govern the natural or the cosmos or the universe. So the social and moral and even political aspects of life were understood primarily in the context of the spiritual. And the end of life is the eternal salvation of the soul, meaning that uh, the believer, the faithful, will earn eternal salvation in the company of God, but this will only be possible through faith and grace coming from the divine source, who is God Himself. Right. So that somehow tells us about the an overview of the basic conception of reality ordained by God. Now, based on its Judaistic roots, Christianity teaches that there is no other God but Yahweh, and He is the creator, the giver of life, the one that sustains all of creation. And of course, He entered into a relationship with mankind. Okay? So, the whole of human life, not just reality, the whole of human life is always understood in relation to God. It always takes a religious meaning. Of course, the Muslims, like the Jews and the Christians, they also believe in one God. They actually worship the same God, only that they call this the God, this personal God, by different names. Okay, God, Yahweh, Allah. These are all different names for one and the same God. So historically, the development of Christianity cannot be separated with its intimate relation with philosophy, especially during the early part of meaning during the early part of the Middle Ages, until, of course, the flourishing of Scholasticism during the 12th, 13th century. Okay, so Christian belief consists in theological theories or doctrines that seek to explain the facts of faith and then relate them to one another or to human knowledge in general. And the basic doctrines of Christianity, as we have already mentioned, is primarily based on the teachings of Christ, who the Christians believe is the Son of God, and that his teachings uh, were also the will of God or Yahweh. Okay, so uh, it's very important to understand that this notion of, or the conception of reality during the medieval times is always associated to these basic Christian beliefs. Okay, so faith is very much significant, very much crucial uh, in the understanding of reality. And the formation of the doctrines or the teachings uh, is essential in the discursive and rational, uh, meaning the understanding or the formulation of the doctrines of the faith uh, is essentially a discursive and rational purpose, of which uh, there is a need to provide some kind of a rational justification or rational foundation for the belief or for the doctrines. And the Christians uh, used integrated philosophy into their doctrines in order that their doctrines will not just be purely theological, it will always also have some rational basis. So that when they engage people, for example, in a discourse, then uh, they can provide a rational justification for that faith. And that's how faith and reason were integrated into Christian philosophy. The basic doctrines are theological, of course, based on revelation and based on the scriptures, but they needed to provide a kind of a rational foundation of that belief of those theological doctrines, and they turned to philosophy, okay, to provide a kind of a rational justification for the doctrines based on faith. So, in relation to therefore, the development of philosophy and in general, and of course, of the theories on reality during the Middle Ages is a kind of a synthesis, okay, a kind of an integration of the rational and the theological, of reason and faith, or philosophy and uh, theology. Okay, so now the development of the Middle Ages can be divided into three periods. The first is the period of the evangelization, which occupies the first century of the Christian era. During this time, Christianity is diffused as revealed religion. It contains the truth within itself. Okay, and there's no need for rational justification. Okay, so that's the early period. The second period is the patristic period, which runs from the beginning of the second century through the 8th century. And during this period, Christianity was forced to defend itself against the errors which threatened it from the outside, meaning paganism, and the errors from the inside, meaning the heresies. So the church fathers worked out a kind of systematization of the dogmas of Christianity. They have to systematize the doctrines to explain the doctrines. Okay, and here they started integrating philosophy into the doctrines, or into the teachings rather of the doctrines, to provide some kind of a systematization of the doctrine. So very prominent figure during this era is Saint Augustine of Hippo, okay, who uh, integrated the Neoplatonic philosophy into his theology, which is actually based on the theology of St. Paul. And then the third and the last is the period of the Scholastic, which runs from the 9th century up to the, well, 15th century. Okay. And here, Christian thought utilized, fully utilized Greek speculation, namely, well, of course, the influence of Neoplatonism and later on by Aristotle. And it created now its own philosophy in harmony with the dogmatic teachings or doctrines of the church, which has been systematized by the early fathers of the church. So there was a gradual integration of philosophy into the Christian faith, or into Christianity, and that's somehow uh, uh, formed or characterized the development of Christian philosophy during the Middle Ages. So, philosophy during the Middle Ages is essentially Christian because, of course, of the development, the development of Christianity as a religion, which tries to integrate philosophy into its teaching. Now, let's go now to one of the most important period during this, uh, which actually linked the ancient and the medieval, and this is uh, Neoplatonism. Okay, so it's not really a period; it's not a historical period, but it's one of the dominant philosophical traditions during the period between the ancient and the medieval. So, Neoplatonism essentially connects the classical Greek philosophy with medieval philosophy, which somehow provided a vital link and continuity between the and Greek philosophy and uh, Christian medieval philosophy. Uh, so, Neoplatonism, as the dominant philosophical tradition in the later part of the ancient period, adopted or was adopted by the Christian and Muslim thinkers. And it actually had a lasting influence in medieval philosophy. The term Neoplatonism was coined by the late 18th century, and it was used in a rather pejorative sense to distinguish authentic Platonism, okay, that is the philosophy of Plato found in the dialogues, from the later systematization and transformation that Platonism underwent in the third up to the fifth centuries, starting with Plotinus. Okay, so it's still based on the philosophy of Plato, but it already have some mystical interpretation, mystical interpretation of Plato, and this sort of mystical interpretation uh, of Plotinus uh, formed the main core uh, philosophy of Neoplatonism. So, of course, we can trace the roots of Neoplatonism to the Jewish Hellenistic philosopher Philo Judaeus, who combined Greek philosophy, particularly, of course, the philosophy of Plato, and then, of course, some Pythagorean ideas, with the Judaic religion in a in a comprehensive system. So his philosophy, the philosopher of Philo Judaeus, anticipated Neoplatonism and the Jewish, Christian, and Muslim mysticism. Philo insisted that of uh, the transcendent nature of God, surpassing human understanding and therefore indescribable. And he described the natural world as a series of stages of descent from God, transmitting in matter as a source of evil. He advocated a religious state or theocracy that was one of the first to interpret the Old Testament for the Gentiles. Now, this this series of stages of descent from God is very important because that will also characterize the Neoplatonism of Plotinus, especially Plotinus' notion of the hierarchy of beings. And this hierarchy of beings of Plotinus will also influence the philosophy of St. Augustine later on, as we will see when we discuss the philosophy of St. Augustine in the main lecture. So, Neoplatonism emerged in the third century as one of the most influential uh, philosophical and religious schools, and it is an important rival of Christianity. So, Neoplatonism and the early Christians. It was founded by Ammonius Saccus and his more famous disciple Plotinus, and eventually it will be Plotinus who will fully expound on the ideas of Neoplatonism. And again, Plotinus based these ideas on the writings of Plato, but he focused more on the more mystical aspect of the philosophy of Plato. And of course, he also integrated some of the Pythagorean ideas and, of course, uh, the, the notions of Philo. So, the main function of philosophy for Plotinus is to prepare individuals for the experience of ecstasy. So you can already see here the mysticism that would characterize Neoplatonism. So the experience of ecstasy in which they become one with God. So God is the one. He is beyond rational understanding and is the source of all reality. So in Neoplatonism, you have the one, and then the nous, and then the soul, and then matter. So this is the hierarchy of beings according to Plotinus. Okay, and of course later on, as I already mentioned, this will influence Saint Augustine, and Saint Augustine will now interpret the one as the truth. The truth meaning subsistent truth, and that subsistent truth is actually God Himself. Okay, so according to the Neoplatonists, the universe emanates from the one by a mysterious process of overflowing of divine energy in successive levels. So the highest levels form a trinity of the one, then the logos, which contains the platonic forms, and the world soul, which gives rise to the human souls and the natural forces. So this is a kind of a trinity that you have the one, then the logos. Of course, it's not really a triangle, but it's a kind of a hierarchy. So you have the one, and then you have the logos. The logos or the nous contains the platonic forms. So and then the last one is the world soul, which contains the individual souls of human beings. If you go back to Plato, there are two worlds for Plato. You have the world of ideas or the world of forms, and then this physical world, which according to Plato is just a copy of the world of forms. Now, but for the Neoplatonists, there is a being on top of the world of forms. This is actually the one, all right? That is the source of all reality. Okay, uh, that is God. So that is God, and then you have the logos or the nous, which contains the forms. Uh, Saint Augustine will interpret this as the divine ideas. Okay, the divine ideas, and then you have the world soul, which contains the individual souls, and then of course the natural forces uh, of of matter. But of course, in uh, i- uh, in Plotinus, matter, is the lowest. It's the lowest emanation of the one. Okay, so the highest goal of life, according to Neoplatonism, is to purify the self, to detach oneself from from the world, from worldly desires and worldly comforts, and through philosophical meditation to prepare oneself for that ecstatic union with the one, with God. And this idea of Plotinus, of the Neoplatonists, had a very strong influence in medieval thought. It actually influenced a lot St. Augustine. And St. Augustine would actually pattern somehow his philosophy uh, with the Neoplatonists. Of course, the other influence of St. Augustine is the theology of St. Paul, which we are going to discuss in detail in the main lecture. So, after Neoplatonism, the next important period or philosophy is first the period of the fathers of the church, patristic period. And one of the most important figures, or the most important figure during the patristic period, is of course Saint Augustine. Okay, so the patristic period, or the period of the early fathers of the church, extends from the second century through the 8th century. And the numerous writers of this age are called the early fathers or the church fathers, because uh, they are the guide, meaning the defenders, actually the main interpreters of the Christian faith or the Christian doctrines. So they were the ones who interpreted the Christian doctrines and guided the early development of the church. So they are not just church leaders in the sense that they lead the church. They are also the ones who interpreted the Christian doctrines, teachers, the main teachers of the Christian doctrines. And while many of the fathers of the church were also, so many of the early fathers, rather, of the early church were philosophers. Okay, they were philosophers because they were trying to, again, provide, as we have mentioned, a systematic interpretation of the Christian faith, and they needed philosophy to do this. So many of them are philosophers, but none of them is overly preoccupied with philosophy than Saint Augustine. Okay, so Saint Augustine was really the one who sort of led the interpretation and the systematization of the Christian doctrines. And of course, as we have already mentioned, he was influenced by the idealistic tradition set by Plato, and then, of course, transformed by the Neoplatonists. And he was also influenced by the writings of St. Paul. So his philosophy is a combination of the theology of St. Paul, Pauline theology, and the Neoplatonic Platonic idealism, starting from Plato and down to the Neoplatonists, because he wrote so many books. You have the City of God and the Confession. Um, Here, the process of reconciling the Greek emphasis on reason with the emphasis on religious emotion in the teachings of Christ and the apostles found a very eloquent expression in the writings of St. Augustine. So St. Augustine developed a system of thought that, through subsequent uh, changes, amendments, elaborations, eventually became the authoritative doctrine of Christianity. So many philosophers, Christian philosophers during the medieval era, looked up to St. Augustine as an authority in the interpretation of Christianity. And because of St. Augustine's influence, the early Christian thought, particularly during the patristic era, and of course, even during the early part of the 13th century, 1200s, they were Platonic in spirit. They were Neoplatonic in spirit. And of course, later on, Aristotle's philosophy would later dominate uh, scholastic philosophy. But during the patristic era, it was the philosophy of Plato or Platonism. Okay, so St. Augustine argued that religious faith and philosophical understanding are complementary rather than opposed, in that one must believe in order to understand, or and understand in order to believe. So, like the Neoplatonists, uh, St. Augustine considered that the soul is a higher form of existence than the body. And he taught that knowledge consists in the contemplation of the ideas, okay? Uh, the Platonic ideas, the ideas of the good, the truth, justice, etc., that have been purified of both sensation and imagery or images. So through St. Augustine, the Platonic or Neoplatonic philosophy was combined with Christian concept of a personal God who created the world and predestined its course, with the doctrine of the fall of humanity, requiring the divine incarnation in Christ. Of course, you don't find this in Neoplatonism. I mean, the idea of a world created by God, predestined, God who predestined its course, and then the incarnation of Christ. These are now Christian doctrines that are integrated with the Platonic concepts. So St. Augustine attempted to provide a rational solution to the problems of evil and predestination, uh, the the notion of the freedom of the will, uh, and of course the problem of evil, which articulates that how could there be a good God, a God who would create a world full of evil. So if God is all powerful, all knowing, how could it be possible that He could create this? This who could allow evil to exist in a world that He created. And of course, He also provided some kind of an explanation, no? uh, to the Trinity of God, okay, to the doctrine of the Trinity. And then, of course, also St. Augustine conceived of history as the struggle between the forces of good and evil. Okay? Between the forces of good and evil. So, uh, we have it's very important that we understand this idea of St. Augustine, because that defined how reality is viewed during the patristic era. Uh, Now let's go to scholasticism. So in the 11th and up to 11th up to the 5th, 15th century, there was a revival of, again, there was of course the continuity of the philosophical development, and during the 11th century, there there was a revival of the contact between the European, the Western world, and the other parts of the world. Okay, so in the Western world, the increasing contacts, increasing exchanges, okay, increasing exchange of ideas, and so on. So that resulted in a kind of a general awakening of cultural interest that culminated in the Renaissance, of course. So the works of Plato, of Aristotle, and the other Greek thinkers were translated by Arab scholars and brought to the attention of philosophers in Europe. So while the philosophers in Europe during the patristic era were just focused on the philosophy of Plato, now they are in now they have in their hands the works of the other philosophers, most specifically Aristotle. Okay, so the Muslims in the Jewish and even the Christian philosophers interpreted and clarified these writings in an effort to reconcile philosophy with religious faith and provide again a rational foundation for their belief. Uh, Now, the Muslims, the Arabs in particular, they turned to Aristotle to provide them with a philosophical foundation for their Islamic faith, so that for them Aristotle is the philosopher. Well, of course, the Christians, they were still into Neoplatonism or the philosophy of Plato, but little by little Aristotle's works and ideas made its their way to to the Christian thinkers. So that later Christian thinkers, especially during the Scholastic era, they now turn to Aristotle. Aside from the philosophy of Plato, and then of course Saint Augustine, now they have uh, the philosophy of Aristotle at their own disposal. So, what characterized the scholastic thought? First, there's a common language and method. Okay, all philosophers and learned men, they spoke one language, and that is Latin. And this enabled them to collaborate in common endeavor despite the differences in race. So the Italians and the Spanish and the Germans and the French and the English, they can communicate with one another because they use a common language, which is Latin, the Roman language, of course. And they also use a common method, which is intellectual and dialectical, deductive method. And of course, this kind of method was introduced to them by both Plato and Aristotle. So this method, which disclaimed the oratorical mode, adopted a direct approach to the mind in order to lead it to pure truth or to the truth itself. So no rhetorics, okay, but simply straightforward method in order to reach the truth. Okay, so without denying induction, it showed preference for the syllogistic, huh, for the syllogism in presenting experience in the deductive form. So the preferred method is the deductive method, and the most basic form of the deductive method is the syllogism. Okay, and second is the assimilation of the past. Scholasticism is an effort to create a system of thought based on a rethinking of the Greco-Roman philosophy. And this dependence on the past unified scholastic thought in the influence of Aristotle, although of course not as exclusive, but because there were other influences, but it was more, Aristotle was more dominant. So this effort to assimilate the past was alive, original, and developed through successive stages that culminated in the 13th century. Of course, the Renaissance thinkers and the other modern thinkers, they considered medieval philosophy as a kind of, passe, that it did not, look to the past. So it's old. Medieval actually is a pejorative term. It's a negative term. But when you try to study medieval philosophy, especially scholasticism, it's also an effort to, integrate, to assimilate Greek philosophy. Okay, it's also a an effort to rethink the Greco-Roman philosophy. So it's similar to what the modern thinkers did. They also went back to the Greek classic and tried to see what they can, what they can apply in their period, in their era. All right. So they did the same. They did the same in this sense. But the modern thinkers, the Renaissance thinkers, consider the Middle Ages as the Dark Ages because it was all religion, it was all faith, it was all superstition, so they say. But if you're going to study, we focus on how the Scholastic integrated the Greco-Roman philosophy, rethought it, okay, assimilate it, give it provide a system for it, integrated that with their Christian faith. It's not the case that they were just, it's a dark age. It's not a dark age. Okay. So it's not the case that the medieval period or the scholastic period is a period of darkness because what they did with the Greco-Roman philosophy is also what the Renaissance did in their philosophies. Okay. The scholastic philosophers showed the same, showed the same uh, rigor, showed the same passion, showed the same, uh, uh, discipline in integrating Greco-Roman philosophy with their own faith. The difference, of course, between the scholastic and the medieval and the modern is that the medieval, one important factor in medieval philosophy is the Christian doctrines and their faith. But how can you fault them? That's their experience. We philosophize based on our experience, and part of that experience is their Christian faith, the Christian doctrines. Okay? So, but anyway, let's move on to the third uh, character, which is actually, I think, this is what many of the Renaissance thinkers are, fretting about, and this is submission to faith. Okay, the submission to faith or the submission to the Christian doctrines. So this trait is the most salient unifying factor of scholasticism. And just like St. Augustine and the other early fathers of the church, scholasticism was at hand to curtail presuppositions or propositions that are opposed to their faith. So to correct some views and to suggest some views and truths for rational consideration, which, though revealed, were attainable by reason itself. Okay? So the distinction between the natural and supernatural orders is gradually established with accuracy. With accuracy. So if before in Saint Augustine and even Saint Anselm, the other fathers, while they made a distinction between reason and faith, ratio and fides, but the distinction is still very much rather cloudy. But during the scholastic era, the distinction was more or less clear and accurate, especially with the distinction made by Saint Thomas Aquinas. So, in the 13th century, scholasticism was already an independent philosophy and a science, perfect in its own order. So, but of course, still remained under the influence of faith. And therefore, uh, during that period, they say that philosophy is a handmaid of theology. But as a handmaid, it was philosophy who carried the light during times of darkness. It was philosophy that and reason that the scholastic philosophers used in order to engage with the believers, with the pagans, or with the uh, with the Gentiles. Right. So, of course, during the scholastic era, there was a less interest in discovering new facts and principles. The main focus is to demonstrate the truth of existing beliefs. And of course, as we have said, the method is dialectical, uh, deductive, argumentative. Okay, and of course, let's not think that the scholastics were all Christians because there were also Arab and Jewish scholastics. Okay, so we have Vicena, we have uh, Abisebron, we have Gabirol, who actually also adopted the the uh, the Aristotelian concepts to the Jewish faith. During the Scholastic era, it continued to be influenced by faith, but somehow there is now a distinction between philosophy and theology, or between reason and faith, and that will define how they are going to view reality. Okay, so that's some kind of preliminary or a kind of introduction to our discussion on medieval philosophy. And in the main lectures, I will focus on the theory or the conception of reality of St. Augustine, and the conception of reality of St. Thomas, which I would mainly call a kind of metaphysics. So it's a metaphysics of St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas. So thank you very much for listening.